David said himself at the very beginning, I'm going to die by the hands of Saul, so the only way I can get out of this is to go into the land of the Philistines. We make plans. They're not always good plans. God provides. God protects. God was going to protect him, period. He could have stayed where, well, I won't say it. I don't know. We're just going to move on with that. Verse 5, and David said unto Achish, if I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? It's interesting that he appeals to the king and probably told him that he and his men would be no threat to him. And again, if you look at that, the royal city where the king was dwelling, he didn't want to be a burden. He didn't ask for control of an area or even a town. But what do we find out in verse 6? Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day, whereof Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. That's why we said it forever changed the whole thing. Ziklag was first mentioned as one of the towns of Judah. Some say it was then given to the inheritance of Simeon and back to Judah again. But it becomes a very important city to David and to his 600 men. In fact, you'll find in the next couple chapters where David goes out on an excursion and all of his family and all of his men's family, they're all taken captive. And David now inquires the Lord what he should do and finds out what he should do. But verse 7, in that time David dwelt in the country of the Philistines. He dwelt there, the Philistines, was a full year and 4 months. So he spent quite a bit of time. Now some will argue and say that, well, it wasn't really a full year and 4 months. This, the way it's worded in the Hebrew could have been 4 months and 4 days. I'm going to take it for what it is, a year and a half nearly. That's there. What is more important is what happens in this city, or how David uses this city as a base of operations. David didn't just live and he didn't just survive there. He made some conquests. That's why we come into his dispute. So mind you, this chapter is only 12 verses. So it's one of the shortest chapters we've had so far. We've dealt with chapters having as many as 42 verses and got them done in a half hour. This one, not so much. But verse 8, and David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. For those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest ashore, even unto the land of Egypt. So in other words, they originally were there. It was part of, again, God giving this land to Israel, because these inhabitants were heathen and they had rejected God, which tells me that originally they had known God. Something about them. But anyway, we have the original inhabitants of the land and also the enemies of Israel. The Geshurites are on the other side of Jordan. Syria is associated with them, and it's also a place where David found another wife related to the king Geshu. David seems to collect wives wherever he goes. The Gezrites are said to be a Canaanite city, a city that's often occupied by traveling hordes, but it's a Canaanite city. The Amalekites, we know who they are, descendants, of course, of Amalek, which came from Esau, and actually they were promised war with Israel from generation to generation. And they will be a future problem to David and his men. That's exactly who takes Ziklag, is the Amalekites. So this was also what we're going to see in this next verse. Pick up another little tidbit. Verse 9, when he goes out, he fights these cities, but David smote the land, and he left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep and the oxen and the asses and the camels and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. So now remember, he's in Ziklag, if you remember that map that we had. He's gone out in these excursions, but then he comes back and brings everything back to the king at Achish, and instead of going back home. And this is part of his plan to maintain his cover for his seat of operations. Notice now David's deception. What does he do? And Achish said, kind of like, where you been today? David comes marching in with all of his men. They're bringing all these goods. Remember, they have got the animals, they've got the goods, they've got even the clothing, the apparel. They left no one alive. They brought all the goods back to him. And so Achish said, whither have you made a road today? And David said, now notice the creative way that he describes this. Instead of what we read in the earlier verse about the Jeshurites, the Gezerites, the Amalekites, he phrases everything differently. Well, where did we go? We went over to the south of Judah, and that's exactly where he went. And we went to the south of the Jerahmeelites and against the south of the Kenites. So geographically, he is accurate. He's not lying. He's just not telling him who that he wiped out. Now, the other thing that you see, David and his men, again, showed up with these goodies to present to King Gath. Kind of, I think, interesting, too, where you find that pattern of that word today makes me think that possibly David had done this before, or it was known that David and his men were making these raids. I do not know. But seeing what he brought and that his men looked like they had come from battle, king wanted to know, what roads are you making? What are you doing? What's out there? Well, let's look at also what appeared that David did. Looked like he was harming his future to be king over Israel. And that's exactly what he was presenting this for. Verse 11. And David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath. He left no witnesses. He left nobody to be able to rat him out about what Saul's men are not spying over here. Okay, so he's making sure there's not going to be any leaks about what's really going on, saying lest they should tell on us, saying so did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. So what do you see? David's deception. What is he doing? It's not that he's lying. He's just not telling him all the truth. He's not telling him everything that's there. Verse 12. And Achish believed David. And notice here again, you get the idea. This is the reason why David said this. Because he knew that by doing this, the king would say he hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him. If he was out killing Israelites, which is kind of what he made it sound like, I'm going over here, I've killed some people in the south of Judah, I've taken all this land. Well, yeah, but he's not killing Israelites. But he's making it sound like he did. So this way, the king of Gath would say, well, he's made his people to abhor him. Therefore what? He shall be my servant forever. In other words, he's cutting off his nose to spite his face. He'll never be able to return to Israel ever again. You think about it, Saul had failed to destroy all the enemy when he was commanded to, and he lost his kingdom. So was it right for David to go out and wipe everybody out because he was making sure there were no witnesses left to betray him? Well, again, all of these nations were already commanded by Israel to wipe them out. They were supposed to leave none of them alive. David is fulfilling what God had called them to do, but he's not letting someone else know what he's doing. So this was part of David's plan of deception, and it protected both he and his family and, of course, his men and their families. Israel, of course, does not utterly abhor David because David is not killing his own people. He is not wiping out cities of Judah. And besides, God would never allow David to be a servant to Achish, whatever. God has anointed David to be king. David does not correct this perception, but instead keeps this as a pattern. And in the next chapter, David will have something to do with unique methods of communication. Or I should say, we'll see some unique methods of communication, not just with David, but with Saul. In fact, I will say that the next chapter that we're going to look at will probably be either one of the most misunderstood, warped, or strangely taught chapters, because it has to do with Saul and the witch at Endor and trying to call up Samuel. Well, did he really do it? Did he not do it? Did they have the... Well, we'll talk about that next week, and hopefully we'll be able to get through that without too much problem. Pray that's been a blessing to you tonight. It's a short chapter, but still a lot of good lesson in there. Whenever you get down and out, go find those Psalms where David is pulling himself up out of despair, where he is encouraging. Remember, there were times where he said, even when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, I'd lost all hope until I went into the sanctuary, and then I saw their end. David always corrects himself, or the Lord corrects him, but David always gets corrected one way or the other. And that's why David is also called a man after God's own heart. But he was by no means a perfect man. He had troubles with despair, and I believe even depression.